I can give you some idea of how many we produce. Yeah, because people are at home, they've got kids and they've got commitments. So far, we have delivered 400 sets of scrubs to the NHS, and the target is 700. Everybody's working really hard. They're all freelance. There's us from the theatre, there's all the TV people, they're all freelance, that have all their jobs got cancelled, as our theatre shows got cancelled. So it's great that we can, particularly for me, it's just like having that opportunity to play a very small part in it is so essential.
Of course, and what you're doing is invaluable, and I'm sure is so welcome by any of the hospitals that receive what you're doing. Theatres are dark up and down the country. It's a very, very difficult time for something that's a huge part of the British economy. What are your thoughts about, how much do you know about when the Royal Exchange and other theatres might be able to get going again? What's been said to you and everybody else in the theatre where you work?
Sort of like everyone else is finding out each time how long the lockdown is going to continue. Our general idea is we probably won't be looking at anything till September, because it's affected all of our shows coming off. Because we need to sort of we're a month in advance getting ready for rehearsals, making the costumes and set.
Hello? Hello? Hi, Ben. Hey, there's a lot of background noise you have to mute once the thing's underway. Hey, are we live on YouTube? To me, YouTube is frozen. Hello? Hey, Davis. Davis.
Ben, I muted actually. I muted, but I can
Hey, Fiona.
Hey.
Hey. It's all super laggy.
Frozen.
Yeah. Perhaps it'd be okay when we actually broadcast. Are we now going to embed it in the, activate the broadcast and embed it in the site? David? Hello? Hello? Hello?
Ben, I can hear you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Okay, push.
I
Push
can
the
hear
button.
all of you.
Okay, good.
I've just unmuted.
So let's go ahead and begin the broadcast, no? Because we're not using, this isn't the webinar panel, is it?
Yeah, this is.
Where's the Q&A thing? And
It's at the
yeah.
bottom.
So I need to not be a panelist.
Okay, how do I... Ben Morse.
Ah, yeah, because you've got the moderator view, I see.
Yep. Okay, so I've got mute. No, not mute panels entry. So I can mute you, Ben.
Can you make me not a panelist?
No.
I shouldn't be appearing in that top list of pictures. I should be in the list down the side.
Yeah. I can't see an option to do that.
Plus, if I just come out and in again.
Yeah, try that. Hi, Blessing. Hi, Blessing. Can you hear us?
Yes. Hi, Fiona. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm very fine, thank you.
That's good. I can hear you, but your video is not moving.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay, it's moving a little bit now. Maybe it will just take a moment to catch up.
Is there any improvement?
No, not really. It's still sort of freezing.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. I hear you okay. The video is just a bit lagging.
Okay.
Should we start the broadcast? Hi, Blessing. Good to meet you. My name is Ben Dayton. I'm the managing editor of SciDev-Net.
Okay. Nice to meet you too.
Hello.
You want to start the broadcast, Ben?
I think we should, because then hopefully it will start working properly.
Okay. Let's go for it.
Are you able to make me not a panelist now?
Let me see. No, I can mute you. I can turn your video off.
Go on, turn the video off. Oh, I see. It's quite rude.
Just blank you out.
Blessing, where are you based?
Nigeria.
Ah, okay. How is the lockdown in Nigeria?
Well, the state I am is not so strict like in Lagos and Abuja, where we have more of the COVID-19 incidents, a higher number. So
Right.
I'm based in River State,
Right.
Port Harcourt, southern
Okay.
part, yes, of the country.
It seems like many in Africa, the incidence rates just isn't as high as it is here in Europe. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I see that we've got some attendees already appearing. We're just getting set up and we should be starting in about 18 minutes.
We're in London, Blessing, and it's a real nightmare. We aren't allowed to leave our houses unless to buy food.
Wow.
Yeah,
I can imagine. Yeah.
It's been like this for 4 weeks. I think 4 weeks. Wow.
Well, where I'm based, there's some sort of movement around. We can still go to places, but like the markets, businesses, even at our workplaces, everyone has been told to stay at home. But once in a while, people still walk around, maybe to get some essentials for the household.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
We're just in the process of setting up the live stream. So we'll be live streaming this on SciDev-Net. Davis, how are you getting on?
Hi, Sarah. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How about you?
Well, thank you.
Good.
Seems you're a little bit laggy, but I think it tends to settle down a little bit after people have entered. Should be okay, hopefully.
Excellent. Hi, David and Blessing.
Hi.
Good to meet you.
Same here, Sarah. Nice to meet you too.
Where are you?
Okay, I'm in Nigeria, but in the southern part of Nigeria, Port Harcourt
Okay.
City, precisely, yes.
Okay. Okay. And where are you, Fiona? You're in London?
Yes, I'm in the north-east. east of London.
And Davis, you.
I think Davis is deeply involved with some technical matters at the moment. We're setting up a live stream which will be on our website. So I think Davis is just organizing that now.
Ah.
Yeah. And where are you, Sarah?
Cambridge.
Oh, lovely.
So the UK.
Ah, Giampiero.
Yes, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
Good afternoon.
Welcome. We've got also Blessing and Sarah on the line here, as well as Davis, our digital producer. He's
Nice to meet you.
Davis
Hi.
is just setting up the live stream for us at the moment.
Good to meet you too, Giampiero.
Hello.
A fantastic collection behind you as well. I love those
They're
little
superheroes.
models behind you.
They're little superheroes, my son.
Yeah, it's good.
He doesn't play with them anymore. I do.
So I was going to say, perfect.
I'm mute.
Just going to move for a moment.
This is the first time that we've used this Zoom webinar function to hold one of these events. So it's a bit of trial and error for us with some of the technology. Hi, Davis. Rupa should be joining us shortly, and then we can get started. We'll just get started in a few minutes, everyone. We're just waiting for our final panelists to join. Hey, Rupa.
Sorry, my last meeting was running a little late, but but I was like, I'm definitely coming.
That's no problem. I think we're going to get started in a minute or two.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening.
So welcome, everybody. It's just gone 2 o'clock GMT. So we'll kick off now. So welcome to this special SciDev-Net debate, where we will consider whether gender analysis should be embedded in responses to epidemics. My name is Fiona Broom. I'm currently in my lounge room in London. I'm the acting global editor at SciDev-Net. And if you're not familiar with us, SciDev-Net is the world's leading source of reliable and authoritative news, views and analysis about science and technology for global development. And our mission is to use independent journalism to help individuals and organizations apply science to decision-making in order to drive equitable, sustainable development and poverty reduction. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. This COVID-19 pandemic is testing the limits of health systems, as well as those who are working within those systems to provide healthcare. Women in particular are on the coronavirus front lines as healthcare workers and primary caregivers. However, policy responses globally often fail to consider how gender and epidemics interact. There's still a lot that's unknown about COVID-19, which is the disease that is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. Researchers and policymakers are doing their best to react to these uncertainties. There's a lot of big questions that people are thinking about right now, not just policymakers, but ordinary citizens. These questions include, are more men dying of COVID-19 than women? Are women at greater risk of violence in lockdown? In stretched health systems, who will receive priority care, who might miss out? Do diagnostics, treatments, and vaccine trials take gender into consideration? And does personal protective equipment keep everybody equally safe? Before we begin the discussion, I'll just mention a couple of practical matters for those of you who may not be familiar with Zoom. Questions from the audience are warmly welcomed. You should be able to see just there at the bottom of your viewer, there's a Q&A button. Just click on that and use this option to ask your questions, and I'll do my best to open them up to the panel. We'd love for this to be a discussion, and I know the panel are keen to engage with you all. Let's start by introducing our panelists. Joining us today, we've got Sarah Hawkes, who's the co-founder and co-director of Global Health 50/50, which is an independent research initiative focusing on gender equality and health equity. We've got Rupa Dutt, who's the executive director and co-founder of Women in Global Health, and Rupa's an internal medicine physician. We've got Giampiero Fivato. He's the director of the Institute of Leadership and Management in Health at Kingston Business School, and he's the editor of PLOS ONE, which is the American Public Library of Science journal. And we have Blessing Odogwu, who's a plant science and biotechnology lecturer at the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria. And Blessing's also a member of the Organization for Women in Science for the Developing World, OWSD. So I'll let our panelists tell you a bit more about themselves and their work. Sarah, how about we start with you?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona, and good morning, good afternoon, even good evening to everyone. So Fiona's raised some really good questions as a kind of starting point in terms of what we currently understand about COVID from a sex and gender perspective. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing in Global Health 50/50. And that work really builds on a lot of previous work that we've done looking at the impact of gender on health outcomes. And the starting point for understanding the impact of gender on health outcomes is to have a really good handle on sex disaggregated data. So that's where I'm going to come to in what I'm about to tell you. But perhaps I should just start with a very quick definitional issue, because Fiona is right that I am the co-director of Global Health 50/50, but I'm also professor of global public health at UCL. And one of my academic obsessions is around definitions. And in this case, I think definitions actually really matter because well, they matter in many cases, but they really help us to understand what it is that we're talking about. And in the health community, we've got pretty good evidence to show that although there is a widespread understanding of the difference between sex and gender, when people start to write about sex and gender, they frequently get the definitions wrong. And so if you look at analyses of publications around sex and gender, they frequently use the terminology interchangeably. So just to be clear on the definitions, sex, we're using sex to refer to the biological differences between men and women that in this case may be contributing to why we're seeing different disease outcomes distributed across the population of males and females in any country. And we're using gender to mean the social construction of roles and behaviors and norms and expectations, and essentially your place in society is a socially constructed place dependent upon your identified gender. And so while sex is generally a binary category, your male, female, sex is, gender is anywhere on a spectrum. And the relationship between sex, gender, and COVID, I think we can quite honestly say at this point, is not entirely clear. But we have got a good starting point, which is understanding some of the sex disaggregated data from a distribution perspective in society and from an outcome perspective in society. So in terms of the work that we've been doing in Global Health 50/50, we've been collating the sex disaggregated data reported by national governments. And we've so far collated data from about 55 countries. And one of the important things to sort of note right from the start is that actually around half of the most affected countries are not sex disaggregating their data, which we can, I'm sure, come back to in terms of response. Their data, we're able to see that when it comes to who's actually infected in the population, in other words, the distribution of infection in the population, it's about equal between men and women. And yesterday, WHO reported on about 750,000 confirmed cases, and it had an almost equal sex ratio distribution across those 750,000 confirmed cases. That varies according to age group. So in the very youngest age groups and in the older age groups, you tend to see more men infected. And in about the 20 to 29-year-old age group, you see more women infected. But that's the cases of infection. What we're also interested in is what happens to those cases of infection. And what we see from the data on death is that in every country that reports sex disaggregated death data, there is a substantially higher risk of death amongst men compared to women.
Thanks, Sarah. That's really interesting. Let's jump into that a little bit further into the conversation. I'll just invite Rupa now to maybe tell us a little bit about her work.
Great. Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Sarah. Just really building on what's already some of the questions you were raising, Fiona, about what we're uniquely seeing. So women in global health, we focus on advancing gender equality and global health leadership, and uniquely, we really are looking at who's driving the conversation on health security, and particularly health security response, both at the global level, at the country level, and some of the numbers that really stand out in our spaces when we take a look at the health workforce, the frontline, majority of that frontline is actually women. So 70% of the health workforce are women, but when you look at senior roles in global health, they average around 25%. Specifically in COVID-19, we've actually seen task teams around the world showing much lower numbers, sometimes actually having not even a single woman in the task team. The United States started that way, but most countries are, for the most part, averaging about having 10 to 20% women represented in large task teams that have about 20 members in. So we're really seeing a stark difference between where the expertise and knowledge is at the front line, as well as there is expertise and knowledge at the policy line, policy, science. We know that women are equipped with a talent, but they're not being represented. And this clearly has an impact on how the response is being shaped. We know there's lived experiences of women in the front line. quick example I can give is that health systems are what we say often designed by men for men, but when you look at who's actually makes up the health workforce and the health system, it's women. So we've seen cases of PPE, personal protective equipment, being designed for male bodies, where majority women are using it and having challenges, especially in China. There wasn't explicit efforts to ensure that they were designed in a way that if women are menstruating, UNFPA has sent dignity kits to help support women during their menstruating times. It's almost as if you look at the workforce, women during especially disease outbreaks and pandemics, they are in the gender roles, expected in most societies to take care of children, do the school homeschooling piece, provide care for elderly, and if they do have family members with disabilities. In addition, they have their health task, and on top of it, putting themselves at risk for disease exposure. So they have had to make difficult decisions whether to stay in the workforce, whether to opt out, which we are hearing cases of women making those difficult decisions, and then facing further financial hardship. So a lot of the work that women in global health is doing is making sure people know that one, there is a big gap of women's representation in these conversations. More importantly, we need a gender responsive approach. We've launched a 5-point call to action, which we're really asking for equal representation of men and women at all levels of decision making on COVID-19 and actually the whole health security agenda moving forward as we build back better. Our second aspect is, yes, we should continue to applaud health workers, but it's more important that all health workers really have safe and decent work conditions. And the third part is really, we know that the health sector is built on unpaid work. 50% of what women do in the health sector is unpaid. That amounts to about $1.3 trillion US, and that's considered an underestimate. And that number usually goes up during disease outbreaks. And we know the impact that these are going to be the first women, the volunteers, that will leave a health system, and essential services such as vaccinations will cease to occur, and the house of cards comes tumbling down. The fourth part, really echoing a sentiment of what Sarah Hawks was saying earlier, is that we really do need to make sure that there continues to be sex and gender disaggregate data. Otherwise, we're running blind. So, we echo the sentiment that there really needs to be a gender analysis happening in the response, so we can learn and not continue to operate that way. And really, the fifth part is an organization that represents a global movement with chapters around the world. We know women are the social protection net in many countries, and right now, we know that women's movements and organizations are not seeing the benefits of some of those large relief packets. We need to think about how institutionally we ensure that financial flow actually reaches communities at the grassroots. And then this is, again, part of the building back better process. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Rupa. Gianpiero, we were discussing some of these financial implications for women when we spoke the other day. Would you like to speak a bit more about that?
Absolutely, is one of the few things that we actually know better than already, because every single time that there is a big shock in the economy, the impact of the shock creates inequalities, or actually is felt differently by different people. And women are by definition hit more hardly by those kind of problems for a variety of reasons. First of all, they already make less money on average than men. The pay gender gap is big enough in Europe, is bigger in the United States, and I believe it's going to be even bigger in other countries. What does it mean? It means that if they make less, they have less available income to save. Hence, if the income stops all of a sudden, they have less resources to cope with. So women are extremely vulnerable. Another reason why in helping, in taking economic measure to help the population, we should consider gender inequalities is because women are overrepresented in many sectors that actually are going to be mostly impacted by the lockdown. I think about all the cleaning services, restaurants, helpings, and this has to be taken into consideration for a couple of reasons. In the short term, because they should be privileged in terms of getting support from social services, whatever they add in different countries. Also from a perspective, a kind of view that we finally are going to have a vaccine. We will need to prioritize the distribution of the vaccine. I heard a lot of politicians say that they will push for everybody to be vaccinated, but this is impossible. It is impossible simply because it's never been done so far. So I don't see how this can be done right now, and there will be an economic burden, unsustainable. So we will have to choose. And women, for the way that the duties are related to their gender, they are more exposed to jobs that are in contact with people. So this may represent a risk, an additional risk. Another suggestion for ideas is that we still don't know what's going to be the role of infection on pregnancy. We don't know if it's going to be an active transmission. We don't know if it's going to, if pregnant women are going to be an easier target for the virus. We know very little about that. So we should think once that we have the vaccine, that probably women that in fertility age should probably be privileged. What I'm saying is that I am here advocating for data. This is what I love. My wife makes fun of me because she says that numbers talk to me. And they probably do. In this moment, numbers are very confusing to me. We don't know enough. The difference in gender representation in the data coming from the COVID makes me hard to understand or to give any suggestion. I truly believe that the implication by gender are going to be very important, both from a medical and an economic point. But we really need to understand better. I am coming from another devastating example for that, about that. I've been spending 10 years of my life studying the HPV vaccination programs. And HPV was born 10 years ago under the label of the anti-cervical cancer vaccine, the women vaccine. Well, it took us 10 years to realize that boys should be vaccinated as well. It is very dangerous to label a disease at the very beginning. And I am very concerned when I see the newspapers today talking about higher incidence of death in men. Because I fully agree with Sarah, we have the same data from Italy. They are not at the spectacular level of detail, but they do confirm that the virus seems to infect everyone at the same rate overall. So there is no sex difference between men and women. It is true that men die more often than women. This is probably due to the fact that the highest number of concomitant diseases that you have, the riskier you are. And individuals with 3 or more risk factors are probably more common in elderly men than elderly women. But the reality is that we really don't know exactly, we don't have enough data to make any kind of conclusion about sex and gender in the COVID. all the numbers.
That's really interesting, Gianpiero. I think we'll come back to that discussion of data shortly. And thanks for your comments there. We'll just bring in Blessing and give her a chance to introduce herself. And perhaps Blessing, as a plant scientist, maybe you have some reflections on food security at the moment.
Well, good day, everyone. It's afternoon here in Nigeria. My work is focused on improving food security crops using high-end technology. I'm also an advocate of gender mainstreaming in research and technology uptake. The organization I represent, OWSD, is an international forum that unites eminent women scientists from the developing and developing worlds with the objective of strengthening their role in the development process and promoting their representation in scientific and technological leadership. The organization is providing and supporting women in research training, career development, and networking opportunities for women scientists throughout the developing world at different stages in their career. Currently, the organization is joining the fight of COVID-19 by supporting women groups to design strategies that will strengthen the adaptive capacity of women combating COVID-19 in vulnerable areas. When looking at the fact that COVID-19 is one of the biggest challenges we have globally. In fact, it poses a big threat to food insecurity because both lives and livelihoods of people are significantly impacted by the pandemic. The spread of the disease is affecting all significant elements of food production, supply chain, and demand. So the measures being put in place for prevention and risk reduction are likely to affect food production and trade. One of the challenges we've observed over the years is the fact of gender inequalities, especially in the food system. And looking at the challenges already posed by the COVID-19, it is really possible that this challenge or these inequalities will come to the fore when we look at the different gender groups who are having access to the interventions or the measures being put in place to curb their disease.
Great, thank you, Blessing. I just had a question that's come in from the audience, from Tek Gurung. The question is, how can women farmers be given higher priority in national policy to cope with the problems associated with COVID-19?
Okay. Should I answer that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Like we have seen during food production, that all gender groups are involved. And from the look of things, from the data we have already, we are seeing that when it comes to food production, women are more involved in the production of food, in the production or even in the process of choices of food choices of food that is being consumed. Right now, we've seen that there's some palliative measures or recommendations that have been given to governments, which they are putting in place, such as encouraging more persons to, encouraging a lot of data to be taken on gender-based data gathering analysis to inform decision-making, providing and enhancing the capacities of these women to assess inputs, such as seeds, fertilizer, and so on and so forth, and then to support them to continue to produce food for their families and communities. But if you look at most of the recommendations being given or measures being put in place, this is affecting the women. But really, we can't say for sure because we are still gathering data, which we hope that it will give us a clearer picture of what the women are facing at the moment. But one thing we can say is that from previous epidemics, data gotten has shown that usually women are among the vulnerable groups that have been neglected during agricultural interventions because of the roles and responsibilities they play in the society. So we are hoping that with what has happened in previous pandemics won't repeat itself in this current situation because of not collecting correct gender-based data. So we're hoping that when data are collected on gender, we want to see how the roles and responsibilities of women are changing based on the impact of the epidemics on people, especially those in the vulnerable groups, such as the women farmers. And I hope that that cover the question. As we continue our discussion, I'll be able to also bring more answers to that.
Thank you. So I think everybody has mentioned data and the need for data in your respective fields. Do we have data from previous epidemics that give us a clear picture of impacts of gender? Is the data that we need being collected now? And if it's not, how can we go about that? Perhaps, Sarah, let's start with you.
Thanks, Fiona. So, I mean, I think it's really important to be aware of what kind of data we're asking for. So the kind of data I talked about is really about the primary impact of the infection on people's health and their clinical outcomes. And, you know, in the context of frequently hard to collect that data and to analyze it in real time. But data from certainly data from previous coronavirus epidemics should have led us to not be surprised with the kinds of clinical outcomes that we're seeing now. So the clinical outcomes, which is excess of male death and an association with other comorbidities, is essentially exactly what was found in the epidemics of SARS and MERS. And I mean, I think that, you know, we can learn a lot from other epidemics in terms of what might be driving that excess of health outcomes amongst men. Even in the Ebola epidemic, you know, the New England Journal data from published in 2017 or so, again showed an excess of male deaths and was able to analyze that in terms of health-seeking patterns. So, you know, I think it was almost predictable, had we paid attention from the beginning, that we were going to see the kinds of outcomes that we've seen in terms of medical health outcomes. The kinds of social outcomes and economic outcomes that Blessing and Rupert and Giampiero have referred to, again, I think that even in the absence of data, we can sort of predict where the brunt of the burden is likely to fall, which is probably the gendered impact will be more borne by women than men.
Thank you. Blessing, we've just got a question coming in from Alexandra Solomon. Are there concerns regarding the potential increases in child labor in farming communities? We saw this in Sierra Leone during Ebola, which can lead to adolescent pregnancy and early marriage. Can you speak to that?
Okay, yes, there are chances of it happening because when the men and women, like the data we are seeing already from the health sector about the men being more, both men and women being infected, but men being the ones who are more, who succumb more to the disease. There are going to be chances of roles and responsibilities shifting from most homes that are men-led to either the women and the children. And like we say, there's high chances of that. And that is why we need to look at measures that can address these issues before it comes up. In fact, from what experts are saying, there are chances of food crisis, and because of communities trying to source for food and also for income, their chances of these other vulnerable groups being forced, just like the children, being forced into farming, cheap labor, and also a lot of issues of sexual abuse coming up every now and then. That's why there's really a call for us to address these gender inequalities. If some gender groups their capabilities can be enhanced for them to be involved in some of the decision making, be involved in some of the responsibilities and roles they play or that are being dictated by the society. If there's a change in this, it will really go a long way in curbing that. And that is why we are really advocating for us to get a gender-based data, for us to see this picture clearly so as to advise the policymakers that most of the policies or measures being put in place are more or less like one size fits all. That is not really the case in the field. We need to really look at how the roles or responsibilities being played by each gender group can affect how they deal with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Great, thank you. I had a question that came into me yesterday from Alvaro Wills, who's at the National University of Colombia. He asked, do you think that gender analysis can help to avoid or reduce domestic violence? This is an important problem related to quarantine. Ru, perhaps you can take that question?
Yes, happy to, Fiona. And I also wanted to just chime in to one of the other questions that was raised about really women's perspectives. Work that has been done even during analysis of the Ebola outbreak. There is a very known researcher by the name of Julia Smith who's done a lot of work on disease outbreaks. And some of the stuff that she showed during the Ebola time is that when organizations built in equity principles and had components where women's leadership and perspectives were built into the response, the agenda and response tended to be a lot more comprehensive and included women's, particular how they were seeing the disease, and the response was much more tailored to some of those, issues of financial protection, issues of gender-based violence. Those type of things were then part of the response. So, kind of answering your question specifically for gender-based violence, we know that there is really great research coming out of the World Health Organization, great toolkits from UNFPA and the World Health Organization. So there are good resources, but what we're seeing is that countries are not necessarily using these gender responsive toolkits. Instead, it is still a very sort of almost one-sided response. There's examples where women are being told, here are some tips on how not to make your, male partner upset and angry during these stressful times, instead of really having more of a gender responsive approach, where we see in France, they have set up both male and female hotlines. And so really gender analysis needs to not only be about what are some global norms and standards, but it needs to be really taken down to the national and subnational and community level, really emphasizing that point about gender roles are context specific. And so to address gender-based violence, we need to understand, more specifically what's happening and tailor the solutions. And if certain solutions aren't working, we need to continue to adapt that. And that's where, gender is really, really key. And we often say in Women in Global Health, it is a cross-cutting. It's not a special interest. If we don't look at things from a gender perspective, we're just not going to understand, any of the health problems correctly.
Thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in here. They're quite detailed questions as well. We have Namrata Ganeri, who's in Mumbai. There are a number of popular media reports circulating which indicate that countries led by women, political leaders, are doing better. May I please invite comments? Perhaps Rupa, would you like to start, as we've got you?
Yes, happy to chime into that. And we actually just did a political analysis ourselves, a really, really short, quick one at looking at, 2 male leaders and looking at 2 women leaders from around the world, head of states. And what we basically did was really looking at the communication style and cross-checking that with just overall, how quickly have they responded to the pandemic. And what we've seen is that the type of language that women leaders are currently using is much more collaborative, less of using the war analogy to be divisive. And it is often based on more evidence-driven type of solutions. And so that is really important to building more social cohesion and making sure that as conversations about building back better, there's a lot more discussions about social protections being built in. So we are clearly seeing a difference in how they are communicating about it. And then when you compare it to the testing rates, like how quickly they started implementing, the WHO advice and adapting to the WHO advice to their local country context. We know Germany, for example, has had some of the best outcomes in this response. Their health system has been very responsive. They implemented social distancing, physical distancing quite early on, and made sure it was very clear to the population to get tested and have clear protocols, and we can see what the impact of that is. Myself, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I think that by just stating that by itself should say enough, but to be very clear, it is very much a divisive approach here by the U.S. government, not clear instructions, very fragmented, war analogies being used constantly, even internally within the country. What we really are seeing is even just a social disruption by the messages that the administration is putting forward. So I would say to that question, yes, there is a difference, but we do not have enough analysis to say this as a blanket statement. And echoing the sentiment of other panelists on this, Women in Global Health is advocating for a lot more research to be done on gender and leadership as well. Thank you. Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you. So I did want to, we have sort of gone into this a bit already, but I did want to reflect somewhat on national and international responses and policies that have been implemented, not just within this pandemic, but in health crises and in emergencies in general. What is often given priority in terms of policy responses, and do these responses take gender into account? Sarah, could we begin with you perhaps?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it would be pretty fair to say that that in most health crises to date, and certainly in gender has not been top of the list of public health approaches that in most of the countries where where we're able to look at what countries are actually doing. They're not, in terms of dealing with the acute infection rather than thinking about the secondary impacts. I think on the secondary impact side that countries have learned some of the lessons of previous epidemics and are, there's certainly a lot more discourse around about the gendered nature of social and economic impacts. But in terms of the public health interventions, I think that neither sex nor gender are usually being taken into account, and that's again that's simply not unique to COVID. Most of the work that we do in Global Health 50/50 is looking at the gender responsiveness of organizations in the global health ecosystem as a whole, and it's very rare to find organizations that have truly gender responsive policies and programs to benefit the entire population as opposed to a select part of the population.
Yeah, that's really interesting point. I have a question here on the link between higher rates of deaths among men being linked to health-seeking behavior women's health-seeking behavior is often affected by the extent of their agency and other gender issues such as mobility and access to control over money. Do we have a sense of whether there is a difference between the Global South and the Global North? Are women in the Global South actually being found to access health services more? That's an interesting question. Rupa, can you answer that question? Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so just Fiona, can you just repeat the latter part? I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of it correctly.
Do we have a sense of whether there is a difference between the Global South and the Global North? And are women in the Global South actually being found to access health services more? Your organization, I think you have people from about 90 countries. So I think you should have a good perspective on this one.
Yeah, so again, emphasizing this is not quantitative data that we can say by numbers at this point, but what we're getting directly from our chapters. So, for example, we have a community in the West Africa in Burkina Faso. What we're hearing there is that women are not able to access equally, and then and looking back actually from what we can say from previous disease outbreaks is that the first thing to often go is actually access to maternal neonatal child care. And this ends up having a huge impact on both maternal mortality. We also know that family planning services have been cut in the past, and we're already hearing of family planning services being cut now. And this means that there's going to be an increase in millions of unsafe abortions. So that's a very concrete example of it. And I think when you look at COVID-19 specifically, there's often a focus just on how health systems are responding to that particular infection and disease. But we really need to always think about people as all of their health, their mental health, as well as the needs of men and women's other health issues, which are now being really, really challenged. And that's where women are in lower middle income countries clearly facing greater challenges, especially it's interlinked to the financial protections that they have less resources, so they're going to be less likely to access that. More importantly, they have much more care responsibilities. We heard from the president of Ethiopia, I was on a call with her and a few other women leaders with UN Women and OECD 2 days ago, and she was reporting that in communities in Ethiopia, women are spending much more time at home. The single households tend to be led by women, which they're taking care of their children and elderly, and they're less likely to even access those health resources. But getting global aggregated data, it's not out there, and nor is national, but the stories that we are hearing directly from countries in these places show that women are not able to access. A lot of it has to do with the financial, the social responsibilities, and then the health services that they need are often being the first to be, to cut.
Great, thank you, Rupa. There's a question here about documents from the WHO. Is there an internal effort at the WHO to amend documents that are perhaps gender blind? Some of the documents that have the highest visibility and priority, and to have them to embed gender. Rupa, you're nodding your head.
Yeah. We Women in Global Health work very closely with the World Health Organization. We co-chair a gender equity hub on health workforce. I really recommend everybody on this call that is particularly keen to follow how the WHO is responding to health workforce matters and to engage on the gender equity hub, because that's really where we're having these discussions. But specifically the documents themselves, we know that the most recent strategy document that has been released actually does have some gender dimensions, but can be improved. The place to also really pay attention to is what is happening at the United Nations. Their particular plan was quite gender, I'd say, mainstreamed across the board. But WHO is, and I would recommend that we continue to ask them to do more of this. But clearly, it is on top of mind. They are releasing, guidelines for pregnant women, for example, on gender-based violence. But we need to, continue to encourage that there's much more happening on that front. That would be my say. But yeah, back to you.
Thanks. We just have 15 minutes left. Let's dive into the issue of vaccines and treatment development, which I think Gianpiero touched on earlier. I think we can agree that we already know that frequently clinical trials do not fully take account of gender. How do you think that this can be addressed in a lot of the clinical trials that have already begun and which will continue over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months? And what would you like to see happen within these clinical trials? Gianpiero, would you like to start?
Yes, of course. I would like to see at least the issue of gender represented in the clinical trials. But I'm afraid that it's not going to happen because now with this pressure, the objective of the clinical trials will be to enroll as many patients as possible and as fast as possible in this race, which is, by the way, fully justified by the medical need. The need for gender neutral data is a need that needs to be carried over for a very long time, because the lack of gender data belongs to a big, broader group of data that are missing, which are basically all the one related to good epidemiological data. And the reason why we don't have good epidemiological data is because they are very difficult and expensive to collect, and nobody want to pay for that. So we will need to keep pushing for data and studies that are going to have a good representation in terms of gender and gender by age, because I'm still convinced that during our life there are biological and behavioral differences that may have an impact on the diffusion of these diseases. Once again, I agree with Sarah. We should have learned from the Ebola. We should have learned from a lot of other diseases. If I look at the response of our governments in Europe and in the United States, I should conclude that the learning has been minimal. Because if we are still debating without a vaccine, if we should rely on herd immunity, it means that really we didn't learn much. Huh?
Yeah. And Blessing, if, as Gianpiero said, if collecting this kind of data and implementing these trials fully is a very costly exercise, how can this be overcome in some of the lower and middle income countries?
Well, if I understand you right, you want to know how such trials can affect the economy of the lower countries, or you want to know if the impact it's going to have on them?
Yeah, how can we ensure that women are included in some of these trials and that these potential future treatments and vaccines can be fully effective by including women?
Okay, I had mentioned before there's still need for make policies or great measures that will enable or enhance the capacities of women in the developing world, or to have access to these provisions or interventions. And really, like I would say, we still need to identify these women. We still need to understand the roles and responsibilities that they have currently as a result of the pressures from the COVID-19 disease. We still also have to know what measures both the national and international government is doing to ensure that they have access to other healthcare provisions and not just healthcare provisions. So I would say that there's still need for the government, there's still need for well-meaning organizations to look into the fact that most of these women are being marginalized because of the roles, because of their responsibilities that are not really captured when most of these interventions are being given. So really, it's something that we really urge that, or will you say that collecting the data or this information during the gender-based analysis will help us to really have a clear picture of what they're going through, so as to advise policymakers to develop measures that will really trickle down to them.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Baising. So we've just got 10 minutes left. So I think given that we've got this amazing Brains Trust in front of us, it's something of an opportunity to come away with a few solid recommendations for perhaps what we'd like to see in future policy outcomes. I know that we could all talk about this forever, but if we can try and limit ourselves to just a couple of minutes, I'll just go from right to left. So Rupert, I'll start with you.
Great, thanks, Fiona. So just really top level agenda items that we would say is number one, we should make a rule globally that every committee that is being created in the health community needs to have gender parity, whether it is reporting to a head of state or whether it is in our own technical agencies. We know there's a huge gap there. So number one, that should be a policy rule that all of us can implement in all of our own working groups. Number two, improve the decent work conditions, especially for female health workers, and acknowledge that it is females that are in the health system. So design PPEs, design working hours, making sure that it's factored in that we acknowledge health systems are not gender blind. Number three, half of what women do in this sector is unpaid and in the informal sector. And as another panelist talked about, the social financial protection matters. We really need to formalize these jobs. The most invisible people are the ones that are really providing essential services to keep the health systems running. This includes the janitorial services, the lower status jobs. We also need to factor those into this process. Number four is going to echo the sentiment of panelists that we really need much more sex and gender disaggregated data, and there needs to be funding allocated to make sure that all those large sums of monies that is being transferred around the world or within the country has a percentage dedicated, what we call gender-based budgeting. And then fifth, make sure money is actually going to the grassroots organizations, especially those that are led by women. And there's been comments by some of the attendees on this particular topic, and really emphasizing that this needs to be paid, compensated work. And let's continue to make sure we have diverse perspectives at every aspect of decision making. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Rupa. Gianpiero?
Well, I'm going to save you time because I don't have two recommendations. I have only one. And then the one is that any policy, economic, in public health, before being approved and become operational, should receive an approval, the approval of a real equality commission. It's going to look at the equality implication of any government decision, and without any kind of bias in judgment, it's going to give it the opinion in terms of equality impact.
Thank you. Very
that's
succinct.
That's what I have.
Great, thank you. And Sarah?
Yeah, thanks. I've just been making a couple of notes that actually very much echo what Gianpiero has just said. That, I mean, I think that we have moved into an era geopolitically, particularly over the last 5 years or so, where we have had policymaking that has been evidence uninformed, and it has been on the basis of values, whether we agree with those values or not, or ideologies rather than evidence. And I think what something like COVID really throws into the public limelight is the importance of having evidence, and evidence that takes equity across a range of dimensions into account. So it's important to know about sex and gender, but gender in particular is just one of many intersecting inequalities that people across all walks of life will suffer from. And the more evidence we have as to the inequitable and unequal impact of something like a pandemic on people's lives, the better we are able to then argue for evidence-informed policy making rather than just value and ideological policy making that we have suffered from at a global and national level over the past number of years.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And Blessing, if you'd like to round us out.
Okay. Well, the COVID-19 health crisis has a drastic effect on food security of the vulnerable groups. Right now, building skills and capacity alone is not enough. We have to address inequalities that make women and men vulnerable in the first place. Though we risk a looming food crisis, there should be measures taken fast to protect the most vulnerable so as to keep the global food supply chains alive and mitigate the pandemic's impact on our food system. We still want to raise our voices to the call for maximizing the impact of agricultural development on food security by enhancing women's roles as agricultural producers as well as the primary caretakers of their families. Back to you, Fiona.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That feels like a good place to leave it, but we do still have quite a lot of questions coming in. I did see one before. This one comes from Professor Yangabi, who's in Nigeria. There is a need to generate gender guidelines to respond to COVID-19 with consideration of socio-cultural determinants as experienced in African communities. I thought that one was a question. Sorry, it was not. We have a question from Alexandra Solomon asking us, who is responsible for conducting a cost-benefit analysis for including pregnant women in vaccine trials? Is there an international standard? I wonder if there's a way that we can take some of these discussions offline. Perhaps we'll include some of that back on our webpage. This conversation has, of course, been recorded and it will be posted on SciDev-Net, so you'll be able to watch it back. I'd like to say thank you very much to our panelists for joining us, and thank you very much to our attendees. This was our first webinar that we've held. I feel like it went really well. So thank you again for everybody's interest, and everyone stay safe, take care, keep well.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, so this webinar is done. Let me see how I can pick up the recording. Thank you so much for attending our webinar. We'll see you then. Goodbye. Until next time.